Well, good afternoon and welcome to the second video lecture of the second section of Security Foundations, Intro to Security Foundations at WazU. My name is Lee McWhorter and I'm the instructor. Today we're going to review the second set of 5 lessons in the second week of material for the Intro to Security Foundations class. Last week in the first video lecture we covered the first 5 lessons, and as a quick recap before we dive into the new stuff, excuse me. We of course covered there's just basics, the Intro to Security Basics lesson, and a lot of key terms and information in there. We also then spent some time talking about various types of security roles, both from a conceptual level as well as practical roles that various individuals fill in the field, and some prospects for the field as well. We then also talked about attacks, the basics of different types of attacks, denial of service, malware, all those kinds of things, and then a little bit about different types of threat actors, from the amateurish script kiddies to the more experienced criminal professionals to government actors, nation-state actors, etc. Then we cover the basics of information security, talking about some of the information controls that we use, like acceptable use policies and other types of rules and policies that we use to control the security posture of an organization. And we also then spent a little bit of time talking about the 7 domains, which are very important as a theoretical model for setting all this together. And then we finished up with lesson 5 on some of the defense basics, some of the challenges of defense. And we began and spent some time talking about defense in depth and layered defenses and things like that. And so in this lesson, or in this lecture, we have 5 more lessons 6 through 10 to cover. And lesson 6 is where we'll begin today. Lesson 6 is on further defense concepts, and it builds on the ideas that we talked about at the end of last week, the layered defenses and defense in depth and all that stuff. We have 4 main new defense concepts to talk about briefly here, and I'm only going to cover these fairly briefly. They're conceptual and pretty straightforward, but they are diversity, limiting, obscurity, and simplicity. And these are defense concepts that we want to keep in mind as we're designing defense architectures, as we're designing defense policies, and putting together a full organizational security policy for a company or organization. Diversity refers to, and is in some ways related, of course, to layered defenses. As we talked about last week, and as the materials talk about in the concept of layered defenses, you want to have more than one defense. We don't want to be like the French during the war, depending upon the Maginot Line, and the Germans just went around it as their one line of defense along the border. We don't want to just depend on our firewall and think, yay, we're secure. We want to be able to have different sets of defenses. So we want to have firewalls and other types of equipment. We want to have policies in place that protect information. And so we have all these different aspects and controls to give us a very deep set of layered defenses. Diversity builds on to that by bringing in the concept of, let's not only have layered defenses, but let's have different defenses. Let's have different defenses at different layers. Let's have different defenses of different types. And so an example we use in the material, which is pretty common, is let's not necessarily have all of our equipment from one vendor. If we had picked vendor X and we have our firewalls and our intrusion detections and our VPN and everything else about our network is all defended by one brand of equipment, and then somebody comes along and figures out a zero-day exploit for their operating system or their backend firmware, then we may have our entire network just opened up by one fell swoop. So the idea is that we want to use different vendors in that concept. And when it comes to, in addition to just different vendors, as I did last week, I want to sort of emphasize other examples. And so in addition, we want to look at different types of other controls we can put into place. We are going to talk today a little bit later about some of the various security frameworks, and that comes into play, that we might want to use some guidelines and some recommendations from more than one different organization to build our security posture. So maybe we have some different policies and some different controls in place and procedures in place that will help add diversity to our defenses. Excuse me. The concept of limiting is probably, of the concepts in this section, probably the easiest to understand. It's basically the idea of limiting access. If we just have everything wide open, then obviously we're not very secure. If everybody in the organization can get into every customer database, every accounting file, every our source code, whatever, then obviously we are not being as secure as we could be. And in most organizations, it's a pretty common practice that we limit the data. And usually the guiding rule is to limit the data in such a way that we are only giving people access to what they need to get their job done. Remember, we're not in isolation here. We have to achieve the company objectives. So salespeople need access to the sales files to be able to contact customers and follow up and make sales. Accounting needs access to all the sales data, invoices and bills so they can do their work. And so we have to make sure that the people in different organizations in different parts of our organization are able to get their job done, but we don't want to give them too broad. We don't want to just do, which happens many times in small companies, where we have maybe an administrator or two and all of the administrative passwords are the same and everybody shares, a couple of administrators share that. That's efficient. And remember the trade-off from between security and convenience. That's very convenient, but it's not very secure. If one of those people leaves and it still has that password, if the place grows, so there's more and more admins, and now we don't have any accountability as to who's in there. So we want to limit the access not only at the lower level, excuse me, to employees, but to access to data, to shares, to information on the network. But we want to limit even at our administrative and our system administration level amongst our techs who can do what. Many times it's common that organizations split up the roles, as we talked about last week, rotate duties even as part of that. So we don't want to give everybody all the keys to the playground, so to speak, and to the candy store without having some checks and balances in there. Now, the next defense concept is an interesting one. It is called obscurity, and it's the idea that we can gain security from being obscure about things. In the broadest sense, it's a system, the belief that a system can be maintained as secure if no one knows about its internal workings. So if a small team of people build a website or an application or a system, a piece of hardware, an embedded system, whatever it is, and they keep it amongst themselves and only they know that information and its inner workings, then it should be fairly secure that nobody will be able to get into it. Now, the reality is, on one hand, that there's a limit to that because it's very hard to keep secrets. People move on, go work for another organization. There are people out there who will spend the time to try to reverse engineer things, to try to figure out how they work, and just simply pound away at things, trying different approaches. And so even if nothing has been disclosed, that doesn't mean that we can't potentially, or an attacker couldn't potentially get into that system. Now, it's very controversial in the security field, this whole concept of security. There are equally numbered people who think, oh, there's some benefit to this. This is useful, at least in certain areas. And on the other hand, there are people who think this is just a complete waste of time. And as a matter of fact, there's an interesting exercise to sort of be part of and take part of a discussion about that and give us your opinion as part of the exercise, and looking at a debate amongst some professionals in a particular area with regard to security by obscurity. But nonetheless, it's something that I believe personally has some limited value. It's not that it's going to completely protect you, but what it can do, I think, in some cases, is prevent you from being the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Many times attackers and a lot of the automatic attack tools and things that the script kiddies use, the off-the-shelf scripts, they are going to be written so that they attack the common. So they're going to attack a web server on port 80 and a FTP M21 and in different ports that they expect to be. And so, but those can be changed and be obscured to a different place. There are disadvantages. You can't necessarily take your public website and say, I want to be more secure, so I'm going to stick it up on port 8000 or 8080 or some other number you make up, because now you got to have your customers type that in to get to your website. So that's not convenient, nor is it going to work very well. But maybe another type of testing site or other thing that you might need to have out there for purposes of testing, but you don't necessarily want every script hitting port 80 to hit and attack your external server. So moving that to a different location, and thus making your development people for testing log in with a different URL with a different port, is worth asking those people to do that, because then the vast majority of the scripts that just scan websites, well, not 8080 may not be the best example, but some other number that's not a standard web port number, that gives you a degree of security. a degree of obscurity by keeping you out of the radar of sort of the standard attack models. Now, if someone, a criminal hacker, a nation state hacker, is targeted your organization, they're going to figure out through various scans, as you're going to learn and have already seen some experience, some examples of throughout this program, you will, they will find that port and they will figure out a way to get in if it's exploitable. But it does provide a little bit of an additional layer, like I said, just to keep you from being, your organization from being the low-hanging fruit. At least that's my opinion. And I usually will be clear when it's my opinion versus just clear information. Now, the last thing is security through simplicity. The idea here is that making a security system and processes and procedures, and you can look at this as the whole security process for an organization, as well as look at individual security pieces of your overall procedures. If you make them too complex, then there's very often the sort of inclination on people's part to work around them. So you set up a very complex password policy amongst your administrators to need to get a certain permission to get on a server, or to go create temporary passwords or whatever the case is, and this is perceived and maybe not imposed and enforced by a good managerial backing, but by your staff is onus and too much work, and so they share the temp passwords. Oh, I got one earlier, it's still good, here, you use this. And now they're breaking your security because it was too complex. And so if we can make security systems and security procedures more simple, then they'll be more likely to be understood and followed, is the idea behind it. And the same thing in our design. If we design such a complex system, and here we've talked about layers and diversity and all this, so we're thinking more and more complexity. But if we go too far with that, there's always a diminishing return on things, then the system becomes too complex, and now we're in the problem of how do we keep it maintained and updated and aware of all the vulnerabilities. We have more to scan, more to check, more to patch, and then of course if we fell down on that side, then we've left a hole that somebody could get in. So in addition to the concepts from the first part of the class, these are really important concepts to keep in mind as you think about network design, system design, think about policy creation, think about frameworks, etc. So that's actually a good sort of segue into the next couple lessons. And for the most part, I'm going to cover them fairly quickly and together. But lessons 7 and 8 are on security frameworks. So what is a security framework? Well, up to this point, we've talked about the need to protect, our organization. We have to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our data. And we're going to be protecting networks and trying to look for weaknesses. And we're doing this to keep the bad guys out, to keep them from getting our customers' data, to keep them from using our systems for other reasons. So we can accomplish our objectives and make money if we're a business. We can help people if we're a nonprofit, whatever. That's what we're trying to do. And so we have all of these different needs to protect and defend and create all these different policies and procedures. We have guidelines to create on how to configure different equipment. And we could just start from scratch. But the reality is the industry and the greater community has created a whole bunch of security frameworks. And these are reference guidelines that we in the security field use to help an organization, to help build an organization's security policy. And there are a whole bunch of them. And the vast majority of them are put out by various what we call standards bodies. For example, like we have the National, the NIST, National Standards and Technology Organization here in the United States that sets standards on weights and technology and different rules. We have the European equivalent. We have an organization many of you may have heard of, ISO. Maybe because you have an ISO disk. Well, that's actually that whole CD format. That's a standard put out by, that's why you have an ISO image of a CD. If you have that instead of the image, or you burned the disk from an image, that is an ISO standard. And that name sort of carried on down. But the ISO 9000 is a quality standard that a lot of manufacturers like Dell or others, HP, etc., they adopt that. So as they do business internationally, that they are meeting a certain standard, and everybody, other countries and organizations know that they're to that level. So these standards bodies put out standards in technology and in cybersecurity as well. And we, as cybersecurity professionals, need to be aware of these, because we're going to take, in many cases, elements from potentially multiple of these standards to build our own organization's security policy. And so different reference, standards out there from these different organizational standards bodies, they provide different things. Usually they provide an outline of sort of what you should do to set up your policy. They may have blank templates for things like an acceptable use policy or email policy or password policy. They may have checklists and check sheets for you to go through and help do inventories and asset management controls, to do risk assessments and analysis. And then many times they come with, at least at a high level, even though some go much deeper, they come with controls, recommended controls. These are the things you should do, these controls you should put in place, this policy, make sure you're doing X or Y. And so in the first lesson on the frameworks, we talk about them in general. It's good to note that, like I said, important to note, especially even for testing questions, that the frameworks are usually put out by these reference bodies. Most of them are governmental. Sometimes they're non-governmental organizations, and sometimes they're just, associations, industry associations. And the first one we talk about today, and I should mention one thing, they also, of course, some of them are international, some of them are local, only cover US, whatever. But as we point out, it's actually important that you be aware of all of them, because your organization may need to take into account, you may be an American company working for an American company that sells products online and think, oh, we just got to follow the NIST standards and, any other standards that apply to our industry. But you have European customers because they're buying stuff off your website. Now you may need to take into account the European standards, especially for privacy of customer data and things like that. So looking at that standards framework to get some ideas of, oh, we better put this in place to make sure we're compliant over here, is very important. So now there's a bunch of different ones. Each of those organizations and more, which are mentioned in lesson 7 and 8, there are numerous organizations in this space, like I said, that put out different frameworks. They're all covered. I won't list them all by name or by number. They're in the materials. But the first one I'll talk about, and we'll spend some time with, is the payment card industry's digital security standard. This is one that is very important. It's put out by an industry association, the group of folks, that put out, like Visa and MasterCard, that put out credit cards. And they put out this standard to help protect against credit card fraud. And this standard dictates a certain number of things that an organization that processes credit cards must do if they're going to be compliant and thus keep their ability to use credit cards. And so, and they're very simple for the most part. They require you that you do not use default passwords. That's such a common best practice. You wouldn't think that that would have to be written in as a requirement, but it is, because a lot of their, people use credit cards, small, mid-sized companies don't have a full security team, may not have given this some thought. They want you to make sure you actually have a basic security awareness and training program in your organization. You need to be audited, do self-audits, different things, and you'll learn all about that in the course material. But this is one that we start with in the first lesson on frameworks, because it's one that almost every organization has to deal with. Nonprofits take money. They may have to be compliant if they're taking credit cards, through their website. Of course, businesses that take money online or take payments through the cashiers and swipes and Apple Pay and all these wonderful things, if they're being processed ultimately through credit cards, then they must be compliant. If you fail to be compliant with the PCI DSS, you can lose your right to process credit cards. And of course, if your business is primarily driven by credit card sales, either at the counter or online, then you could pretty much lose your business if you don't have the right proper procedures in place. And this is one of those, like we talked about, why do we defend? We try to avoid cost. We try to keep our company in business, achieve its objectives. And this is one of those cases where meeting these requirements, if our company takes credit cards, we need to meet these requirements. So we need to make sure these requirements are built into our company policy. And like I said, we are not just going to say, oh, we take credit cards, let's meet the PSCI DSS standards and we're done. No, what else do we do? Are we in the financial area? Man, there's a lot more requirements there. Are we we have a subsidiary that has a government contract. Oh my God, there's a whole bunch of defense requirements. So we need to take all these different requirements in and decide what will help us, build our custom one for our organization. As I said, as we go on, then there are a number of other organizations. And like I said, I'm not going to list them all, but we've already talked about ISO and NIST. There's COBIT. There's the IS, as I call them, ISA and IEC, which are different industry, engineering, and technical organizations that have put out various standards. And you'll take a look at those in the course material and do a little more research on them. If you have any questions, of course, as always, let us know. Now, as we move on here, the last two lessons that are covered are in the second week, in the final part of the class, are lessons 9 on threat actors and their attributes. And we've already covered threat actors at a very high level earlier. We talked about script last week. We talked about script kiddies and nation state actors and hackers, etc. So we go a little more into detail on these different threat actors and some of their motivations and attributes that they have. And so what are some of those motivations? Well, it used to be that it was pretty common that people in the early days, and the cleaner, simpler, wilder days of the internet, say the 1980s, not that terribly long ago, but before it had become what it is today, then, you know, if people were doing a little hacking, a lot of times it was information gathering, a little bit of fame, wanted to gain some cred within the community on a bulletin board somewhere. Hey, I was able to get into this and look at what I found, or I was able to make this happen if I did this command. And it was a lot more innocent and, of course, simpler times, as you might say. But as the world moved to the internet and the internet continued to grow in popularity, and we had more and more of us getting email, and then, of course, the web took off and became the huge draw that has totally changed. And as most people, if you ask the average person on the street what the internet, they would define the web to you, where the web is just one piece, but it's become the face of the internet for most people in the use. We're using the web here for a video conference through a website application. And a lot of this courseware, of course, online, and though we do have some labs and exercises that are, you know, not necessarily through the web interface. Especially as you get deeper in, you'll see we're going to have some very interesting lab and simulated lab exercises. But regardless, we do a lot of the work. We have a web portal for all the information, and so the web has become hugely important. And as the internet and the web and all the things that run on top of that have grown, we have seen just along with it an explosion in hacking. There are still the people, whether they're innocently doing it or, you know, don't know better, or whatever the case may be, there's still the people who are just kind of poking around, the script kiddies, the ones that are trying to learn. Thankfully, these days, as we're going to find in our classes going forward, especially some of the later classes, we can set up and attack virtual machines and simulated networks, and we can learn how to do these things and learn how to defend against these things, as we're going to in this program, without having to run the risk of getting in trouble by hitting someone else's server. In the earliest days, it was kind of gray as to what was hacking. If you didn't directly affect somebody, just poking around, you know, wasn't. Today, any kind of activity on somebody else's server is viewed as a crime. So even if a machine out there is attacking you, you can't attack back. The odds are that's not the person who owns that machine is not really the one attacking you. Somebody's taking it over and they're using it through a zombie network to attack you or whatever. So you can't attack other machines, you can defend. And so it's important to understand some of the motivations. There are still people who are just kind of poking around to learn, but the vast majority of people today in this space, being on the black hat side, if you will, the hackers, the criminal hackers, the nation state, they are in it for money. They are in it to steal secrets at the national level, to steal corporate secrets for espionage to benefit their company or other companies or their country's companies, if it's nation driven and not just independent. And then, of course, the criminal hackers are finding more and more and more and more opportunities to be able to make money if they can take over a whole bunch of machines and use them to send spam out. And even 1 in a million persons clicks on that ad and buys that stupid fake product, whatever it is, then they make money. Because in economics, we know the rule of economics says that you will continue to do something in business as long as it's making you money. And that's phrased kind of formalistically as you will do something as long as its marginal revenue, the additional revenue you get from it, is greater than the marginal cost. So if you can send out 1 million emails for nothing and you get $10 back, that was $10 marginal revenue for no marginal cost. So you'll keep sending out, even if it's only that 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100. And that maybe sometimes people wonder, why do they just keep doing this? Why do they keep sending this spam? How does this possibly work? Everybody knows this now, right? Well, no. Somebody will fall for it every day. As I think it was W.C. Fields, suckers born every day. Somebody new gets on the internet, somebody gets a new computer, and they run across, or they go to someplace they've never been before, they see it different. That's why they like to change them and make them look like fake pop-ups and ads and warnings, and they're getting, that's just in those spaces, sending you phishing emails that look like your bank. And these are becoming more and more common, and they're motivated primarily by money. They want to be able to take over these machines, to use them to mine Bitcoin, to send out spam, to take over something else, all part of a plan that generally at the end of the day is trying to generate money. Now, there are a lot of other attributes, and they vary. The amateur script kiddies are usually, that's why we keep saying amateur, they're usually a little bit more inexperienced. They, as I joked, I think last week, a few new crop of them was born last month in December, when they got new computers for Christmas. And they went immediately, a certain percent went and downloaded various tools and started trying things. Most of them didn't accomplish a whole lot. Maybe one of them got lucky and stumbled on an open port somewhere, got into a box. They feel like they're a hacker, yay for them, but they don't know what they're doing. And they're really still more learning mode, even though they can be disruptive, and you need to be prepared. That's why we don't want to be that low-hanging fruit. We want to take all those standard security best practices in mind, because they'll usually eliminate that crowd. And then, of course, the amateurs also have very limited resources. The new computer, the web, which of course is a lot of information, but they don't have supercomputers at their beck and call. They don't have whole farms of computers yet, botnets that they can use, maybe other individuals as part of their network to help with the recon or with the attack, or do social engineering. As you move up the line to the criminal hackers, organizations and associations that are out there, and then definitely into the nation state and other players, then we start to see much more resources and much greater skill levels. And so these are, things to be aware of. And you can many times tell the difference between the script kiddie stuff that's all automated, because it'll just hit your logs and be pounding on a regular basis, as opposed to, oh my gosh, this looks like the trail of somebody who really is or was here typing these commands and doing these things. And so the sophistication and the level of access to resources and additional support varies greatly amongst the players. Now, while that all makes sense, I'm sure, it's obviously a more professional or government-sponsored hacker is going to have more resources and money and probably skill than an amateur one. There's a whole spectrum of where they fall when you look at all the different types. But one of the things that, there's two things that are important that we add beyond these attributes. We talk about two different other classifications of threat actors that had not been mentioned a few lessons back in just the intro to threat actors, if you will, the overview. And those are, one, the ethical hacker, and then two, what we call non-human threat actors. So let's talk about the ethical hacker first. He or she is a lot of fun. This is as I think I mentioned last week, and I know I get confused from different videos and different presentations with what I have and haven't said, but as I may have referenced in last week's video, the word hacking has kind of gone through an evolution. In the earliest days, hackers were people kind of like they say makers today, that go off and make all these things with, whether it be the highest end 3D printing or just, kits and craft and doing things themselves with both tech and older technologies. But in the early days, the people who built computers from kits were hacking around, putting in different boards, trying different commands, learning different things. There used to be hacking exercises in class at the bigger colleges in the early days of the 60s, 70s, where they were assigned projects to try to hack something. But the goal there was to make it more efficient, write it in fewer lines of code, do it better, learn what you could do. Then over time, as we moved into the internet, the web taking over the internet and becoming what everybody thought of as the internet, and our first exposure to the internet, and we moved on and the hacking became spam and attacks, and we heard about breaches and things like that. Then hacking took on this bad guy role. He became the black hat. And then, of course, we've sort of stolen from the old cowboy metaphor of the Westerns back in the day. And today we've moved into where we have pretty common to reference both hacking as good and bad, the white hat, the ethical hacker, and the black hat, the criminal or malicious hacker. And so the ethical hacker has actually grown into, there's even certifications for that and training for that. But the idea is that an ethical hacker is a person who has the same skills and uses the same tools and techniques and technologies that a malicious hacker would do. The things that we're going to learn throughout this program, how to scan, how to, attack and access certain ports. We want to learn them so we can defend against them and be aware of the new things they may be doing. And of course, they're doing them so they can attack and achieve. So it's a cat and mouse game between us, the white hat hackers, if you will, and the black hat hackers, security professionals, and those malicious players out there in the field. And so we need to be aware of them. As a threat actor, though, why are they here? Well, because they're good guys. They're not a threat to us. Their rules and the definition is that they only do things they have the legal permission to do. But that's why I mention them here, is because, okay, you're a security professional here, and so many weeks, months from now, a year from now, you're working out in the field at some organization, and all of a sudden wow, we're being attacked here. What's going on? It could be the bad guys from whatever part of the world that some association or syndicate is attacking. It could be a disgruntled former employee or a competitor or a nation state player. And it could be the pen tester that your boss hired. So you need to be aware that that's a threat actor. You need to be aware. One of the reasons that it's not uncommon for businesses that I put this here, like I said, is that I want you to be aware is a possible threat coming into your organization, or you might see, because it's very common that a business has a security team. They put their policies in place. They do their own vulnerability pen testing, everything else. They think they're in pretty good shape. But every so often, maybe because it's required by those frameworks, those guidelines, or the industry you're in, or just because somebody higher up the chain, all the way up to the CEO or the board, says, we need to make sure we have some accountability, some checking here. So we're going to hire an auditing firm to come in and do vulnerability and pen testing. But no, let's not tell the IT team or the security team, because that's a good test of them. So that's one of the reasons I put it here. And it's important to be aware of them. You won't just have an ethical hacker start hacking your site like a hacker unless he's been given permission by somebody. But of course, if that is the case, you still need to be aware of them. They're like any other hacker at that point. You need to be able to notice them and react to them, and your policies and procedures should be able to handle. And if not, that's what he or she is going to help you find out, right? So then the other type of threat actor that we hadn't mentioned when we talked about the overview of threat actors in the first couple lessons is non-human threat actors. We tend to focus in the hackers and the breaches of Sony or Equifax or whatever make all the headlines, but we can't forget that there are other threats to our organization, and particularly from our point of view, security of data and networks and our information security, that there are other threats that aren't the human, the insider, the hacker. They're just natural disasters, riots, political upheaval. And these things can vary. You have to take these things into account as part of your planning for keeping your network and your information secure. You can have great firewalls and everything else and never have ever a breach from the outside, but you're based in Miami, Florida, and the next big hurricane wipes out your data center, and you don't have the appropriate redundancy, backup, hotspot type of situation going on, and your company's gone. Sadly, at least a handful of companies, including one fairly sizable player in the options and futures market, if I remember the exact space. But back in the sad day of 9/11, there were a number of companies that they never came back. They had lost too many people. Their whole data was in the office, and that building, of course, went down terribly with no recovery of much of any value. And so if they did not have the appropriate procedures in place, then they weren't able to go on. And that happened to a lot of companies. In addition to the loss of life and all the other sadness of that day, many people lost their jobs, and they weren't relocated and reemployed a few weeks later. They were just out of a job. That company could not survive. They had not done their disaster planning appropriately. And so if you live in Florida, you should take into account hurricanes and power outages and all these things. If you live in California and other places, earthquakes. If you live in possibly Washington, volcanoes, coast, tsunamis, hurricanes, some big storms. If you have operations in other parts of the world where there's uncertainty, political uncertainty, these things need to be taken into account as non-human threat actors and planned for appropriately, especially in the mode of your organizational security plan and recovery plans, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And so that actually leads us into the last thing, and we're going to spend a fair amount of time on it because it's something that is very important. You'll see it come again, like all of this introductory material. There'll be references to these phrases and key terms and these concepts and standards and reasons again and again throughout the course. But it's very important to understand, in a sense, this last unit lesson brings this whole intro together. It sort of gives you an idea of what the purpose is, and that is, like we've referenced before, organizational security. The whole purpose of cybersecurity is to protect an organization's information and assets so that it can achieve its objectives. So whether that's making money, helping feed people, educate people, whatever the organization's goals are, then the security and IT team have to put into place the right set of procedures and policies and guidelines to make that happen. And so we need to take into account all the various types of threats and threat actors and vulnerabilities that are out there. We need to stay abreast in our industry. We need to be aware of these standards so that we can use some of that work to help us guide. But the ultimate goal is to create our own organizational security policy. Either we go work for someplace new or someplace that hasn't gone through that exercise before, or even if we go to work for one of the biggest, most established Fortune 500 companies in the world in this space, you're going to be involved in this piece because they do this continually. These aren't one-offs. Hey, yay, we wrote our organizational security policy. Here it is, president, CEO, board. We're done. We're going home. We're taking a week's vacation. No, we now have to live this. It's a living document, living outline, living documents, living procedures. And we're going to periodically check them. We're going to audit them. We're going to come back to them. And so this last chapter talks a lot about organizational security and a lot of really important concepts, some of which all of which you will see again in the future of both of the program and in the field, but some of which we'll go deeper into in other courses, obviously, as the appropriate time. But one of the big things we talk about is controls. We've used that word a few times. Any type of, whether it be physical, technical, procedural process we put into place that limits access to data or helps us protect the network, we consider a control. So an acceptable use policy that you make your employee sign is a procedural control. A lock on the server room door is a physical control, whether that be good old key or biometric eyeball scanning, kind of on high-end, whatever your needs. And every organization is going to have a different set of controls to achieve their goals. And each organization is going to come up with a different level of controls, maybe for different areas of the organization, maybe for different employee types. Every organization has to go through the process of analyzing what are we from a security point of view. Well, we're an XYZ company. Our goal is to make money or donate, to help people build houses, whatever. And so that's our goal. And we have all of these assets. We have networks, we have technology, we have remote workers, we have internal workers, we have all these different offices, or we're all in one building, or we're scattered around the globe. We have to do an asset. We have to do an inventory. We have to understand what the organization is and what it has and what we're trying to achieve. And we need to look at and do what's called risk assessment, which is a very important piece that you will see referenced multiple times again in the course, and something that you will very likely be part of doing, at least part of, if not being responsible for later in your career, doing the entire risk assessment. But a risk assessment involves looking at all that information you've gathered about your organization, the assets you have, the systems you have, the servers you have, the processes you have, the information you have, and then looking at it from the point of view of what happens if that system goes down? What happens if that data is compromised? What happens if we lose access to that service? What are the risks? And at the lowest level, a risk analysis might be, we're going to just prioritize this as a high or a low or a medium kind of risk. And then we're going to look at the impact potentially. This is a high or a low or a medium impact. And we're going to build ourselves a little matrix, a little spreadsheet, list our areas, list our risk, list our potential impacts to the organization, and then use that as a guiding tool to help us decide, okay, well, We're a company that makes a lot of money on the web, so we have a website. It's a risk. It's a very high risk, and if it happened, then the impact could be huge. So then we have, some other processes that aren't quite as important. We have a guest Wi-Fi on our network for people to come and visit. Our biggest priority, to be honest, is probably going to be viewed as that website, because if it goes down or gets hacked, we could lose our whole business. And this guest Wi-Fi might not be ranked as important, though if they have access to the network and thus could get in, it may be that you've left that. So each organization is going to have to look at it, and each organization has to decide when it comes to risk what they're going to do with it. When you identify a risk, and all organizations, all of us face risk, from the meteor coming like the dinosaur days, again, is a risk we can't control and probably won't happen in our lifetimes, knock on wood, thankfully, but to the risk we can of driving a car has risk. So most of us have insurance in case there's an accident or a fender bender or something. So companies can do the same kind of things. We can look at and say, oh, well, let's get some insurance. Companies have insurance for buildings and fire and various things. You can take out policies that help protect in a case of like some kind of a big outage. You can have backup systems. And so each organization will look at their risk. They will rank and prioritize them. In a more detailed risk organization, you'll put dollar signs to it, not just, oh, we have a website, it's a high risk, and it would be a big impact because we make a lot of money. No, we have a website, it would be a high risk, and it would be a $4 million impact, or a $4 billion, whatever it is. You've done the math on it to decide if we lose this system, and then our remote markers can't get in, that's going to cause so much lost productivity, et cetera, and we take into account. And if you truly look at things, you want to look at everything regarding this when you get down into this at later points. And later, the simple one you have to do for the exercise to get the idea is not as complex, but you need to be aware of this. In many cases, you will look at not only what are the costs associated with an impact that you've identified as the direct cost, but you have to look at the indirect cost. When there is like the Equifax breach, it's only last year, so it's too new for any numbers to have really come out like in their financial statements to take a look at like we were able to with Sony. But nonetheless, this is going to cost them huge amounts of money. They're offering people like credit protection services. They're paying for different things. They're having to face bad publicity. This may mean that a bunch of people want to go over to one of the other services to use more often instead of depend on their credit protection because they can't defend their network. This would be the perception. So they're going to have direct cost, indirect cost, and then what are called opportunity costs. They're going to have lost customers that they could have had. And so while you have to kind of estimate that, that's what you want to do when you do a risk assessment. You want to look at the impact to the organization of if we lose the website, if we lose remote access, if we lose this data center, if we lose this office, and what we mean there is not that it blew up or whatever. It doesn't have to be the worst case. A hacker got in. The power went off for 18 hours because of a riot, whatever. We need to take these things in, and we're going to make our own matrix and rank all these things. Now, then when we look at that and we see, okay, these are the areas we need to focus on, then we need to go and apply these various types of preventative or just, corrective controls, whether they be technical, physical, or otherwise. And then once again, we're going to use these standards we just talked about. And we're going to say, okay, well, we're going to follow the standards from the credit card because we take credit card, but we're also we're going to use the national standards. Maybe we're not in a particular industry like finance or whatever that has another framework specific to our industry. We're just a maker of whatever product. Don't have to necessarily follow any particular industry standard, but we still want to take the national standard and at least look at it. Well, we do have a website, so we might have foreign customers. So let's look at the ISO and European stuff in there. And then we got all these standards and all these different suggestions for policies and procedures, and we sort of filter through looking at our own analysis, looking at our own organization and our own objectives, and then we use that to pick and choose and build our own policy. Overall security policy, which will be full of individual policies and procedures, as I've said before, from password policies to acceptable use policies to the policies on how computers are going to be set up, servers, clients, applications. What is your policy about mobile devices and embedded devices? Do you allow them on your network? Do you control them as an organization? We're going to buy you an X. We're going to give it to you. We're going to have remote wipe capabilities. Or are we just saying, bring your own phone and we'll let you hook up? And how are we going to keep that secure? All of these things are part of organizational security process. In addition, after you've done the risk assessment and looked at, the business impact analysis of now I've put dollars to that risk assessment, like I said, so that's sort of the process. A risk analysis is looking at the risk and prioritizing, and then a business impact analysis is to take that and try to put dollar amounts to it. Okay, based on how much we buy and sell during that period of time, or if that website goes down, we would lose this much money. And during that time, on an average day, in an hour, we usually gain 1 new customer or 20 new customers that are new orders that come in that we didn't have before in our database. So if we're down an hour, not only do we lose the 10,000 revenue, but 20 new customers who not only they were part of the 10,000 revenue, but they may, like a lot of our customers in our theoretical model here, they may be regular customers, right? So if we've lost 10, not only do we lose the short-term money, but we lost that repeat money. So that all has to be estimated to take and take a look at what the impacts would be. And then you want to look at what the risks are of, these non-human attacks, of course, and be prepared to defend against those. And these non-human threat actors, what are the risks of a natural disaster? What are the risks of a problem within our area? And we should take those into account. Each organization is going to have a different set of priorities and rules that they put in place, and then they're going to handle what's the back-end planning, the backside, what we call disaster recovery planning differently. If you are an organization that's pretty small, you don't make a lot of money. I worked for a company where our sort of bad, weather disaster kind of, we're in the middle of the country, so we weren't worried about hurricanes or earthquakes or anything like that. But, bad weather, a tornado takes out transformer, takes the power out. We have really bad flooding, which is not uncommon in this area. And so that takes out an area people can't travel. Or very rarely, but does happen and happens more often in the north, snow day, say. So we had our own procedure. Most of us could work from home. We knew what the procedure was if that happened for our organization. And we didn't have to go to a whole lot of trouble. We didn't have a hot spot on the other side of the country with people ready to pop in. We didn't have another office somewhere else we could shift that work to, but we figured out how to do it. We could work remotely. We had somebody who was really close to our office who was sort of tasked in a pinch. They could, probably get over there to the office if something needed to be touched, a server needed to be rebooted. But otherwise, phones were forwarded, various procedures went on. A lot of people went to work. Some people, on the production facilities were off. But we made our own decisions based on our analysis of the needs. So in addition to doing business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning, which are a part of, okay, we've seen that, now what happens if the worst case happens? Let's plan for it. So we better, in some organizations that involves having backup facilities, hot or warm or cold sites, and those names just vary based on how well prepared they are. If you have a secondary office or server room set up somewhere, but it's all turned off, that's cold. You might have it on, maybe you've leased it from somebody, but your data is not there. It's warm, but you got to still grade it up to speed. And then a hot site is really ready to go. It's like a secondary data center or secondary office that if this kicked off, you could instantly start putting people in there and they would have a replicated set of data. So depending upon your needs, you plan for all that, just like you plan for what level of controls and what level of firewall and what's your firewall policy. You got to plan for what do you do if things do go wrong. And so not everything is a big natural disaster or hands up in the air crazy breach. We also have just incidences that happen. And so we have to put together incident planning as well. And that's when, okay, the intrusion detection system has said something's happened. Looking into it, looks like maybe somebody got in to that database server. Stop, what do we do? So the incident response team would kick in to take a look and analyze that. We might be following our procedures again, depends on the organization. It's critical that we isolate that server. So we take it offline, even if they're, maybe not turned it off, but just off the network to keep it from being communicated by an attacker. But it's critical we get it off. Maybe we don't think that database server is that critical, but its impact on some other, publicly facing site would be, so we leave it up while we analyze it. The decisions of how we respond to different incidents, the rules of them, and whether we call it a true incident or just a tech support ticket, all is defined through incident response planning, and different organizations have different levels of that as they customize their security plan. Some people have dedicated incident response teams, especially if they're big enough organizations, and then others, they have 6 people in IT and security, but 3 of them are the incident response team when an incident is declared. So these are all things that we'll cover more in other classes, but I wanted to make sure that you understood that, in a sense, this is the end goal of the intro to cybersecurity, is to understand all the basics, the wheres and the why for of why we defend and what we're defending against, and what we're defending and who from. And why is this? We're bringing it all together so that at the end of the day, we can help an organization create their security policy, procedures, their architecture and infrastructure in such a way that they will be secure. Well, that's all I have for today. I don't see any questions, so I will wish you good luck, and hope to see most of you here soon. Bye. Thanks.